In Oklahoma, a judge ruled yesterday that drug maker Johnson & Johnson helped fuel the state's opioid crisis and must pay $572 million to the state. A number of provinces in Canada battling opioid makers are looking for similar rulings. Their suits allege that drug companies falsely marketed opioids, leading to overprescription and addiction. The BC government names the maker of OxyContin, Purdue Pharma, and other major drug manufacturers in their suit, and the Ontario government plans to join BC's lawsuit. Earlier today, BC Attorney General David Eby commented on how the results of the case in Oklahoma could impact cases here in Canada.
In Oklahoma, we had a very positive results for people who believe that there needs to be increased accountability for pharmaceutical companies and distributors around how they conducted themselves with the sale and distribution of opioids. This decision is based on very similar facts that are argued by British Columbia in our litigation that's being backed up, supported, and joined in by other provinces across Canada. I think it would have been a more difficult situation had the court in Oklahoma said, you know, we don't see any liability here, but to have a judge say, yes, we do see that there's a serious problem here with how this company conducted themselves, and we do feel that they do need to be paying money out because of the way they marketed these very addictive and harmful drugs, is a very positive sign for our litigation here in Canada.
How will the American ruling impact Canadian cases? Alan Castles joins me now. Alan is a pharmaceutical policy researcher and professor at the University of Victoria, and he joins me from Victoria. All right, Alan, good evening to you, first of all.
Good evening, yeah.
What do you make of the result of the Oklahoma lawsuit?
You know, I think it's one of many that we're going to see fairly soon. Johnson & Johnson wasn't the only company that was involved in sort of the opioid crisis. There have been several lawsuits already that have been successful in the U.S. Against Purdue Pharmaceuticals, big makers of OxyContin. So, you know, this is one of many suits. The lawsuit that British Columbia is bringing, you know, they're naming something like 30 or 35 pharmaceutical companies and distributors that they think are also involved in the crisis. So, you know, this is just kind of the tip of the iceberg, I think.
Including Johnson & Johnson, Apotex, Bristol Myers, and others.
Yeah, that's right.
So how, if any, will there be any impact from what happened in the United States here in Canada?
Well, it's really hard to say. It's hard to predict what the courts are going to decide in Canada versus in the U.S. But I think the main thing that's under the microscope here is the marketing tactics of the pharmaceutical companies, you know, who have been really, I think, quite involved in shaping the nature of what it is to treat pain, and have really sort of recharacterized pain management. And the way they've been able to do this is basically recommend that these very, you know, useful but also very addictive treatments get used for a much broader scope of a patient than you would think.
Yeah. What do the Canadian governments have to prove? For example, do they have to, Alan, prove that perhaps that the pharmaceutical companies underplayed, that they knew how addictive these drugs were, and that they underplayed how addictive they were to potential patients?
Yeah, typically in these cases, though I'm not really sure, but they would sort of see, you know, has there been sort of any intent? What did the companies know? And, you know, I think it's going to focus on what were they telling physicians. And you know, there's many examples where the companies were involved in, say, the writing of textbooks, the education of doctors, the continuing medical education, where those companies were, you know, possibly through their experts and their consultants were influencing the education of our doctors. And that's what some people are saying is the reason why you had such an explosion in the use of opioids and why we've now got a crisis on our hands. So
talk to me a little bit more about that. These education or marketing tools or education tools that they were putting out, should doctors have known that they were partially written by or contributed to by the very companies that had a stake in selling the drug?
Well, absolutely. I mean, there was a very high-profile case at the University of Toronto where the seminars on pain in the mid-'90s were underwritten by a company, by Purdue Pharmaceuticals. There was a student at the time who who really took this to task and basically really challenged the academics on why they're being educated by materials that are essentially paid for by the drug companies. Though at the same time, I would say this is not unusual at all. A lot of our education of doctors is funded by, supported by, helped by the pharmaceutical companies. When people wonder why we live in a culture where there's so much overuse and overprescribing, I think it really comes down to the biased nature of the information that they're getting from the drug companies.
What's the alternative?
Well, the alternative is for independent organizations to be funding our doctors' education about drugs. There are a number of groups in Canada, in Saskatchewan and BC and Ontario, that do independent evaluations of drugs and try to educate physicians. Oftentimes that's a drop in the bucket compared to the marketing might of the drug companies.
Big pharma, I mean, there are lots of doctors who are paid by pharmaceutical companies to appear, to talk. I mean, is that a conflict of interest?
Absolutely. I mean, when you go to presentations, when you go to conferences and so on, and when the speaker stands up, the first couple slides will often list their conflicts of interest. And my perspective is, yeah, it's one thing to list your conflicts of interest, but wouldn't it be better if we had none at all? And so you don't have experts who have ties to the companies on whose drugs they are recommending to our medical students and our doctors.
Yeah. So what should, in your opinion, a doctor do if they've been given, I don't know, a pain medication that they've been told is not highly addictive, that's very effective for people who are suffering from chronic pain? How do they make sure they're not being taken for a ride by a company that has an interest in promoting this product?
It's very complicated, and I know many doctors who are very skeptical and quite appropriately skeptical of even the guidelines that get produced. And oftentimes we see this in areas like diabetes and in hypertension, where the guidelines themselves have been underwritten by the drug companies. And so the groups that I have worked with, we've said you got to be very skeptical of guidelines, especially when the drug companies are paying for them. And I think most physicians are certainly getting the message about opioids, and that there are a whole range of treatments that people can use to treat pain that aren't as addictive and as perhaps troublesome as the opioids.
What's Health Canada's role in all of this? Doesn't the government have a responsibility to make sure everything they're putting in their research is true?
Yeah, it's certainly the stuff that they put in, say, what we call the product monograph, which is essentially the user's guide to a drug. Health Canada scrutinizes that very closely. What they don't scrutinize, though, is the marketing to doctors, and that's where a lot of the, I think, perhaps biased information gets to physicians. They don't monitor that. In my opinion, they don't look at that at all. In the U.S., you've got direct-to-consumer advertising, which is through television, radio, and magazines. You get advertisements directly to consumers. That's not allowed in Canada, though we do get some advertising, of course, that comes across the border. Health Canada, has essentially, we have a law that prevents that kind of advertising, but that doesn't stop us from being influenced from American advertising and marketing.
All right. Alan Castles, pharmaceutical policy researcher and professor at the University of Victoria. Alan, thank you for joining me tonight.
Okay, thank you.